This third section of Chapter 5 is on solving quadratic equations by graphing and factoring. We're going to start out by looking at graphing, but most of the time it's going to be factoring that's going to be how we solve these. So, solving by graphing, first we want an equation, 0 equals x squared minus 7x plus 6. Notice we get everything over to one side, so even if it was all spread out, x squared plus 6 equals 7x, set it equal to 0. Then we're going to graph it by hand. First, we need to change that 0 into y equals, so we can actually graph it, so we have a function instead of just an equation. Y equals x squared minus 7x plus 6. We're going to make a table, and this is doing just what we did in the last section. We have a table. We're going to want to put in our vertex, so negative b over 2a, plug in negative 7 and 1, and so we get negative 7 over 2, which changes just to 7 halves, and plug it into the equation, 7 halves squared minus 7 times 7 halves plus 6. And simplify a little bit. Notice we have negative 49 fourths minus 49 halves. That will pretty much always happen, something like that, where the 49 fourths is exactly half of the 49 halves. Simplify, a negative 12 and a fourth plus 6, negative 6 and a fourth, stick that in our table. So then we have 7 halves, that's 3 and a half. We can plug in some other values here. So we can plug in 2, 3, 4, and 5. A lot of times the vertex is the hardest one to find because you don't get to choose what that is. You can choose the other ones. So we get them plugged in. We can simplify each of these, and you can work on the math, but that'll simplify. We can add them together and then plug them into our table. Then we can graph this, plot the points on graph paper, and then draw the quadratic. Hey, look at that, it's graphed. All right, now what are we looking for the solution? Well, when we look back up to the equation, we're looking for when it equals 0. So that's what we're looking for. We want to see when does y equal 0. And so we can see it equals 0 here at 1 and over at 6. These things are called a variety of things. In addition to zeros, we could find roots of the function, we can find solutions to the equation, we can find x-intercepts of the function. It's asked in different ways, and it depends on whether it's an equation or a function, but it's all finding the same thing. So we see, hey, it looks like it's 1 and 6. Those are just guesses. Anytime we graph, it's all about a guess. We do need to plug these numbers in so we can check our answers. So we can plug in x equals 1. Hey, we get y equals 0. Look at that. Plug in x equals 6. Same thing. Y equals 0. So our answers are 1 and 6. The second way that we could solve by graphing is we can use a calculator. So first we're going to have to graph the function again. Same thing, change it to y equals, and we can plug it into our graphing calculator, and then graph it. Look to see when y equals 0, equals 0 here, and it equals 0 over here, which again is the same thing. It's 1 and 6. And then we can check our answers. Check our answers here. We don't need to plug it back into the equation. We can look at the table. To look at the table, you'd go to the second, then the graph button on the TIs. If you have a Casio or something else, find your table button. But we can look at the table, and we notice we're looking for when x equals 1, it equals 0, and when x equals 6, it equals 0. So that was the same as plugging it in over here. And so once again, we get our answer, x equals 1 and x equals 6. Solving by graphing is great. Using a calculator, you want to be careful for that. There are times when it can be helpful, but there are times later on this chapter and then in the next chapter where solving using a calculator is going to lead you into problems because either you won't be able to or it won't give you the information you need to find other information. So use a calculator cautiously. The second method that we're going to be solving is by factoring. So we have our equation. Let's start with the same 1x squared minus 7x plus 6 equals 0. I just moved the 0 to the other side. So first, we want to think, what is factoring? Factoring is going to be backwards distribution. So we can look at distributing. Hey, we have our two factors, and when we distribute, we have to multiply those two, multiply those, we get x squared plus bx plus ax plus ab. And so we get that equation, which we can simplify, where this x term is a plus b. To factor, we're going to go from here back up to this top row. And really we're looking for two numbers where when they multiply together, they equal this third number, and when they add, they equal the middle number. So with our equation, we need two numbers that will multiply to give us 6 and add to give us negative 7. Thinking about what they could be, let's see, 6 could be a 2 and a 3. Those are going to add to give us 5s, or subtract to give us 1s. We also have 6 and 1, and that in fact works. If we have negative 6 and negative 1, those multiply to give us 6, and they add to give us negative 7. And so if we multiplied these out, we would get exactly what we started out with. All right, so we factored. Well, how does that help us? We've got this thing called the zero product property, which says if a times b equals 0, if two things are multiplied to equal 0, then one of them has to equal 0. There's no other way of getting 0 when you multiply two things. And so x minus 6 times x minus 1 equals 0. That means either x minus 6 equals 0 or x minus 1 equals 0. We can solve each of those separately. X equals 6 or x equals 1. That's solved by factoring. That's the same thing we did when we were graphing on the last slide. It's the same problem. So let's try a different problem. Let's try g of x equals x squared plus x minus 6. So first thing, make it equal to 0. And then we're going to need to factor. We want two things that'll multiply to give us negative 6, add to give us 1. Well, multiply to give us a negative means one of them is going to be positive, one of them is going to be negative, which means when we add them, we're going to subtract. 3 and negative 2 will multiply to give us negative 6. When we add them, 3 plus negative 2 is 1. And then from here, we can solve each of these individually. X plus 3 equals 0, x minus 2 equals 0. So x equals negative 3 or x equals 2. If we look at something like 4x squared equals 81, first thing we need to do, make it equal to 0. Up here, we just had to change the g of x to equal 0. Here, we need to actually solve it. So subtract 81. 4x squared minus 81 equals 0. This looks a lot different than up here. This is one of our special factors. We have several special factors. This first one is called a difference of squares. We have something squared minus something squared. When that's the case, we have a squared minus b squared, we're going to end up with a plus b times a minus b. What happens here, when we multiply, we're going to get a squared, then minus ab plus ab. That middle term cancels out, and then minus b squared. If you don't see this, you could have this be a plus 0x in the middle, so you're looking for two things that multiply to give you 81, add to give you 0. It works, but the difference of squares really does work better. The other special factors we'll see later really aren't worth it. But here, so 4x squared minus 81, well, something squared equals 4x squared. Something squared equals 81. 2x squared gives us 4x squared. And 9 squared gives us 81. So here, 2x equals a, and 9 equals b. Just need to plug that into the equation, 2x plus 9, 2x minus 9. We can then solve each of those individually. 2x plus 9 equals 0, or 2x minus 9 equals 0. We can subtract or add the 9 to get 2x equals either negative 9 or 9. Divide by 2. X equals negative 9 halves or positive 9 halves, which since they're the same, we can actually combine that to be x equals plus or minus 9/2. That gets us both those options. And so that's one of our special factors, difference of squares. The other special factor is the perfect square trinomials, which is if we factor it and we get the same thing. We get x plus 2 times x plus 2. Half the time you're going to figure that out when you end up with the same factor. That's okay. This really isn't that important right now. We'll use it a little bit in the next topic, but it's again something that you can typically find out afterwards. You can factor it perfectly fine without realizing it's a special factor. So we're solving by factoring. Let's try a couple. So the first one that you're going to try, f of x equals x squared plus 4x minus 5. All right, see if you can solve it by factoring. Go ahead and pause the video and push play when you think you have an answer. Think you got it? All right, so first thing, you need to set it equal to 0. That's just changing the f of x to 0. Then we need to factor. What times what equals negative 5 and adds to give us 4? If you got 5 and negative 1, that would be what it is. So we have x plus 5, x minus 1. We can set each of those equal to 0 and solve them to get x equals negative 5 or x equals 1. Is that the same thing you got? Now, one of the big mistakes is people try and multiply to get the middle number and then add to get the last number. Multiply to get the last one, add to get the middle one, because this is what we're looking at, this factoring in the middle. All right, ready for another one? So try this one. G of x equals x squared minus 8x minus 20. It's pretty much the same thing. So see what you can do. Go ahead and pause the video and push play again when you think you have it. All right, think you got it this time too? Well, let's see. So we set it equal to 0. And hey, it looks like negative 10 plus 2. Negative 10 and 2 give us negative 20. Adds give us negative 8. We can solve to get x equals 10 or x equals negative 2. All right, let's do one more. Apparently my pause went in the wrong place there. All right, so try this one. X squared plus 25 equals 10x. So you're going to set it equal to 0 and then factor. So go ahead and pause when you pause it, and then when you're ready, push play again. All right, so set it equal to 0 means we had to subtract the 10x. Factor x minus 5 equals 0, which means x minus 5 equals 0 or x minus 5 equals 0. Those are the same thing. X equals 5 or x equals 5. Do we need to write it both times? No, we only really need to write it once. And then up here, when we have x minus 5 times x minus 5, did you guys realize this was a perfect square trinomial when you were starting out? Hey, it came out to be the same thing. We could write this x minus 5 times x minus 5 as x minus 5 squared. Does it really make a difference? No, not right now. But that's something that can come up in the future. And so this is solving by factoring. We also saw solving by graphing. Be ready to do a group activity when you get to class on this stuff. And I'll see you then.